First off, I want to thank everyone for coming out in such numbers today. It's really a gratifying thing to see, especially on this nasty hot day. I suppose it's better to be in air conditioning than be doing something outside. So, but we really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come down and talk about various aspects of Sioux City history, and that I know means a lot to all of us. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. Well, as most of you know, we're coming right up on tomorrow will be the 30th anniversary of the crash of United Airlines Flight 232 here in Sioux City. And before we start, how many people in this room were living in Sioux City when that occurred? Yeah, it's pretty much most of us. Anybody here that was actually part of the rescue effort? And I had a hunch we'd have quite a few. So many people in the area were key to really the success, the overall successful outcome of that event. That anytime I've ever talked about this, it's great to see how many people were part of that. And so the crash of 232 was, one of those things that kind of came out of nowhere. And if anyone, everyone that remembers it well, you knew when you saw the plane flying overhead that something was up right away. It just was not a normal thing to see in Sioux City. Planes of that size, at least before the air refueling wing was established, just didn't land here in Sioux City. And so, and it was just one of those things that seemed to come out of the blue. Now, Flight 232 was a McDonnell Douglas DC-10 airliner, so it was a heavy jet capable of carrying, in certain configurations, over 500 passengers. The Flight 232 had been in service since 1973, and it had a pretty, really a great service record. It had flown 43,401 hours. It had taken off and landed nearly 17,000 times, and I did a little quick math and found out that if you drove to work and back every single day, 365 days a year, it would take you like 46 years to accumulate 17,000 trips to work and back. And so that does, plane crashes are such horrible events because they generally have, large loss of life. And it's just one of those things that, just strike fear in us, I think, in just about everyone. But, overall, the flight record of airlines is pretty remarkable. And I think that testifies to it. Now, 232 was en route from Denver to Chicago. And so, as usual, Sioux City was flyover territory. And it was actually going to go then from Chicago to Philadelphia was the plan. And it was carrying 296 passengers and crew. So it was pretty, a pretty big load that it was carrying that day. So what occurred is the flight had actually gone over Sioux City, and they were in the area over Alta, Iowa, just to the kind of the northeast of us, up in the Storm Lake area. When a fan disc failed, and you can see the DC-10 is a little bit of a unique aircraft. One of the things that's unique about it is the second engine was actually mounted in the tail section as part of the tail section. So you had two wing engines and then the tail engine, and that ended up being the problem. The disc failure in the engine occurred in that second engine, and when the debris went out, there was an explosion, and it took out pretty much all of the major hydraulic components that ran the plane's flight controls, and so it was just a catastrophic failure. It was one of those things where everything that could go wrong went wrong at one time. There were redundancies in the line. If only one of them had been taken out of commission, it would not have been as dire a situation, but it just happened. Where the shrapnel went through took out all of the main flight controls at one time. And so, just for those of you that don't know, and I don't have an extensive background in aeronautics, but there are several different flight controls in a plane like this. So first off, along the back edge of the tail fins here is our elevator flaps. They're not really shown here, but the elevator flaps can be lowered up and down. They control the pitch of the plane, because when the plane wants to lift off the ground, when the wings bring it off the ground, it's kind of natural for the nose to want to dive down, and so they help keep it straight in the air. So that's one aspect of the control. The other aspect of control is the rudder in the tail section, and that controls what is called the yaw, and that's the tendency of the plane to want to spin around in like a merry-go-round. And so that's another aspect to it. And then, even more importantly, you have the aileron up here along the outside edge of the front wings. And those control they control the plane will want to roll one way or the other, and those are used to keep it from doing that and to control that way for the plane to roll. And then the flaps are the larger sections along the back edge on the inside that are used both during takeoff and landing. On takeoff, they're used to create more lift so the plane can take off without having to go really, really fast. And then on landing, they're used for extra drag and to be able to land at a slower speed. And so all of those things are just really vital to being able to control the aircraft. Now, the engines, as we'll talk about here, are also part of the control and are one of the reasons why the plane made it to the ground in a somewhat controlled fashion. But overall, all of these different components other than the engines were taken out of commission in that one explosion. And so, I'm not sure how to liken it in your car. It's probably like your steering wheel coming right off in your hands and not having any control at all. So the only thing that they could do after that explosion to control the plane was to both speed up and slow down the engines on the wings in the wing areas, because of course the tail engine was out of commission because of that disc failure. So here's a chunk of the tail section that landed in a field up near Alta, and so you can get a sense how just big a piece. I mean, this was a massive explosion. When it occurred, the crew, they knew right away. Of course, there were alarms went off and such, but it was a jolt to the plane right away when that happened. Now, fortunately, there was a very experienced crew in control of the plane. Of course, Captain Alfred Haynes was the main pilot, was the commander of the craft. 57 years old, he had been flying for United Airlines since 1956. He had almost 30,000 hours of flight experience, so lots of experience. William Records, who was the first officer, was 48 years old, and he had over 20,000 hours of flight experience. The second officer, Dudley Dvorak, was 51, and he, again, had close to 20,000 hours of experience. And then it just so happened, so that was the main flight crew, and then it just happened that one of the passengers on the plane was Dennis Fitch, who was 46 years old, and was actually a trainer in the DC-10 aircraft and was an expert in dealing with it. And so he just happened to be there and was able to help the regular flight crew deal with the emergency. So here's these are the radar points that the aircraft followed after the explosion. And so you can see the incident occurred up here. And so it was doing a turn, and it was just going to head towards Chicago, is the idea when that occurred. And as soon as it occurred, the plane was wanting to turn to the right, and it was wanting to roll to the right, and they were really afraid it was going to keep rolling to the point that it would be unrecoverable, and it would just have flown right into the ground. But they found pretty quickly that if they completely took all the power off of the left, I believe it was the left engine, and put the right engine at full power, it brought it up into a stable flight. But the main thing they could do, the main steering they could do, was just to go in circles to the right. And so that's how you can see, while they were trying to figure out, while they in aircraft control were trying to figure out what to do, they were doing a series of right-hand turns for the most part over northwest Iowa as they tried to figure out where to go, because they thought about try to get to Des Moines, or to, at one point they thought maybe they might have to land on Highway 20. There were all kinds of scenarios. But fairly quickly they decided they were going to go back towards Sioux City. Sioux City did not, the Sioux City Municipal Airport wasn't designed for DC-10s, but it had the infrastructure that was probably the best, and it was closer than Des Moines or other areas that could have been attempted. And so you can see they were doing these circles. It did manage up near Lamar's, to the east of Lamar's. They did manage a left-hand maneuver at some point. Not entirely sure how they did that, but they did do that, and then they did one more right-hand turn before they came into Sioux City. So here we have a picture of the plane as it was coming in. Now, initially they thought they were going to have to do a belly landing without any landing gear, because of course the hydraulics controlled the landing gear as well. But there was a backup system in the DC-10, and they were able to make the landing gear drop down. And they really weren't planning on landing properly on the landing gear. Well, the idea was they thought that by getting the landing gear down, there'd be some extra cushion as they hit the ground, and it would help absorb the shock of hitting the ground. Here we're coming in close to Sioux City, in the area of the Southern Hills Mall now. And you can see it. This isn't a typical way an airplane comes in to land, where usually that nose is up, and it of course was moving much faster too than it would have been on a normal approach, as we'll see here in a bit. Another image taken down by the National Guard base. So Sioux City had a couple of things working in its favor. First off, Sioux City has two big, well-equipped hospitals, so that was a positive. The other thing was, not only do we have the municipal airport, but we have the Army National Guard base there, which has fire department. You have trained personnel on the base that are trained to deal with these types of situations. So you already had a kind of a high number of highly trained people in the general vicinity. And then on top of that, there had been some training beforehand, going back to 1987, of local emergency responders in northwest Iowa to deal with something like this happening at Sioux City. And so there had been some thought of how the people of the Sioux City area would deal with a disaster like this before it actually happened. Here again, we're just coming in a little lower, just a series of photos as it comes in. Now it's just before it hit. So there were a number of issues. So at one point, the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Bureau, told Captain Haynes that they did have the option of landing on Interstate 29 if they thought they had to, and he ruled against doing that. But they were originally going to try to land on, I think it was runway 31 down at the airport, which was the longest runway that was available. It was somewhere over 9,000 feet, which was not really long enough for a DC-10, but it was the best that could be done. But unfortunately, because of the limited way of steering the plane, they could only line up on runway 22, which was a runway that had been closed a couple of years earlier, and it was short of 7,000 feet. So even if it had landed, it would have been really difficult to stop, since they didn't really have brakes other than the engines. It was going to be hard to stop the plane on the runway anyway. But the decision was made to try to line up on runway 22 and bring it in. But as it was coming down to the runway, because there was such limited ability to control, especially that the rolling aspect, the right wing actually hit the ground first. That was the first thing that hit instead of the landing gear. And keep in mind, so it was still traveling at 270 miles an hour, and so that's like over 100 miles an hour faster than a normal landing speed. So it was coming in really fast. The other aspect of it was it was dropping much faster than normally that it would be descending as well, something like 10 times faster. And so all kinds of things were working against a successful landing. But when that right wing hit the ground, it actually, the right wing broke off, and then it came around and hit the tail section and broke the tail section off, so it separated it from the plane, and then it veered back the other way, and the other wing hit and broke it off. And so that's why usually when you see a lot of people describe it as cartwheeling down the runway, and the plane didn't actually cartwheel down the runway, the fuselage didn't, but the wings ripped off and they cartwheeled down, and then the tail section broke off, and the main body of the fuselage kind of broke in number of pieces, skidded down the runway, and then ended up tipping over on upside down, and so it landed upside down. And then the crew quarters, the cabin, separated too, so it was in basically three big components by the time it came to rest. And here we have the fireball as it hit. The plane had dropped almost all of its fuel, but still there was enough to create an extensive fire. And here we have an aerial view then that kind of shows how it went down. You can see the skid marks here on the runway. I believe it kind of came up short of the runway as well as it was coming in, landed a little shy of the runway, and then you can see how it skidded about in the cockpit. Ended up down in this area, and it was not found for something like 35 minutes after the responders came. It was just in a ball of debris, and no one expected anybody to be alive in the cockpit at all. And then all four members of the cockpit crew ended up surviving and coming out alive. The tail section ended up the farthest away down the runway, and that was a place of pretty high fatalities. There were some survivors, but that was a area of pretty high fatalities. And then the main bulk of the survivors were in the main fuselage that came to the rest in the cornfield just off of the runways, and ended up finding their way out. So here we have some color photos so here we have the main body of the fuselage that came to rest. And of course, anybody that was there, I think there was low expectations of people coming out of this alive in any fashion. Here's the tail section farther down the runway. Another view of the tail section. But then that's when the responders kicked into gear, and so not only did you have the air. First off, the airport personnel, the National Guard personnel at the air base, and then you had most of the local fire and rescue people, not only from Sioux City and almost all of the surrounding communities of Northwest Iowa, were involved in some fashion in this, and were on the scene already because there was warning, and they were able to keep the plane aloft for a significant amount of time. They were already there on the ground. In fact, quite a few of the ambulances, from what I understand it, had actually lined up on that runway 22 and had to be moved off quickly so that they could attempt the landing. But there was just a large group of people ready to respond then when it hit. And this is a really important thing, and this is where the training aspect really comes into play, is the idea of the triage of the people that they're trying to deal with, because people were in all sorts of conditions, and they had to decide really quickly, the responders, who could be saved and who couldn't, and that's a really tough thing for the average person to do, and it requires a really high degree of training, and it's really one of the reasons most likely that so many people survived, even though some were very badly injured. So here you see quite a few of the 185th personnel there. It's neat to see the various groups of people. You have civilian responders, you have military personnel, you have fire department people from both the airport and Sioux City, and it was really a community effort. And of course, here's the famous photo of Colonel Dennis Nielsen and Spencer Bailey, who was 3 years old, and this became kind of the lasting image of the response to the crash, and is immortalized in the sculpture down at the Flight 232 monument on the riverfront. Here we have people from the South Sioux City first responders dealing with patients, and to me, seeing that debris, it's just amazing to see people just sitting up in even though they're bandaged up and stuff. People actually walked out out of that wreckage. It's just unbelievable. Another image down, it just gives you a good idea of the scale. And so not only did first responders, so then you had all the hospital personnel as well that had been called on to duty to deal with this huge influx of people. And then you had the community at large with things like donating blood and stuff like that, where it was just amazing overall response to what happened in a really rapid period of time. Here we have the Marion Health Center helicopter, which I believe was fairly newly instituted too at that time. And of course, Gary Brown, the head of Woodbury County Disaster Services, one of the people that helped coordinate the effort, and of course the pre-training too, and the coordination of the various departments. So overall, 111 people died in the initial crash, but that means 185 people survived, and that's 62% of the people on board. So that's really unbelievable number of people. One survivor did die of their injuries 31 days later, and so in the end there were 112 fatalities. This diagram shows where the survivors were. The darkest areas are survivors, and the lighter areas are people that didn't make it. And you can see by far, really the vast majority of the people in the middle of the plane, in that middle fuselage part, survived the crash. Not so many up front. Of course, the crew did, which was remarkable as well. And then in the tail section, it was much less, although there were survivors in that area too. But you can definitely see where a lot of the casualties were in kind of in the in-between spots where the plane actually broke up, which stands to reason. I do find it interesting that the first class part has suffered. You kind of tend to think of that as the part that's the best protected, and it wasn't in this case. And of course, so then you have the endless fascination, and that's something that I remember so well, is it being immediately on the national news and having Sioux City in that. And so you had all the media, and then people trying to get down to see what the heck was going on. And so here's just spectators that had climbed up on a railroad car down in the area to try to see over the fences. You could see the tower in the background of the airport. And then, of course, Al Haynes became, certainly one of the heroes of the incident. And here we have a picture of the flag flying half-mast in honor of those that died. So overall, after this happened, a number of things changed. First of all, the DC-10s, it was required that they have more redundancy in their hydraulic controls, so that if something like this happened, you wouldn't have such a catastrophic loss of the hydraulics. Although in the case of what happened here with Flight 232, even that may not have completely saved the situation, but they did. In some ways, the DC-10 design with the engine in the tail section was problematic, especially since the hydraulics coalesced in that area. They all kind of came through a fairly small area, and it lent itself to having problems that way. The other thing that happened is that they did many flight simulations of how the crew handled it, and from what I understand, they really couldn't get a repeat of the way it worked out. And most of the time, when they would, given what happened to their flight controls, most of the time the plane just fell out of the sky and didn't even make it to the ground, let alone have a survivability rating. And so there wasn't a real takeaway for how crews should handle a situation like this that way, because it was sort of a I don't want to use the term act of God, but it was one of those things. It was a random chance thing that various things went right to allow it to get to the ground that really weren't under human control fully. Here we have the people lined up down at the air base. And of course, this went on because you had to have the extensive investigation afterwards. You had to find the black box recorders and all of those various things afterward. And then we have the flight crew being honored later that fall. So, it's amazing. They're standing there receiving this honor a couple of months after, literally like 2 months after the crash. And so you have Al Haynes and I believe this is Dudley Dvorak on the side. And of course, Governor Branstad. And then we have Dennis Fitch or I think this is Dennis Fitch. And then this is William Records. And so then in 1994, we had the dedication of the Flight 232 Memorial down along the riverfront near the Anderson Dance Pavilion, and we have Colonel Nielsen and Spencer Bailey there, one of the young survivors of the crash, to commemorate that. And as probably many of you read the interview with Spencer, who's alive and well after all these years, and just a miraculous part of that. The other thing you probably have heard in the news is that one of the things that was recommended, there were, I believe, 4 unrestrained infants in the crash. And at the time, that didn't require special seating. They were being held on the laps of their parents or an adult. And there was a recommendation to have some type of restraint. And that is something that has not been instituted yet all these years later, that even though that was recommended a long time ago. So something still to be done. But with that, I want to stop there and kind of open it up to have a chance for some questions and comments, especially if anybody that was there has any personal recollections. I would very much like to offer that. Anyone